The message arrived on a Tuesday, and it came wrapped in the kind of language that powerful beings use when they want to sound generous while making a threat. Ambassador Alara Voss read it 3 times at her desk aboard the frontier station called New Geneva, her coffee growing cold beside her as the words sank in deeper with each reading. The Galactic Ruling Coalition extends a gracious invitation to the species known as humanity to attend formal negotiations regarding territorial matters in the Orion Spur region. Gracious. That was the word that made her jaw tighten, because in the language of the Archon Collective, gracious meant you have no choice. An invitation meant appear before us or face consequences. She leaned back in her chair and stared at the ceiling for a long time before pressing the comm button on her desk. "Get me Captain Alistair, Dr. Tanabe, and Seth Morrow," she said, "and tell them to clear their schedules for the next 3 months." Within a week, the team assembled in Alara's private briefing room, a space with no windows and walls lined with signal-dampening material, because what they were about to discuss could not leak to anyone outside this room. Captain Ren Alistair was a tall man with gray at his temples and the calm, watchful eyes of someone who had spent 30 years studying alien military doctrine. He sat with his arms crossed and his mouth set in a thin line. Dr. Yuki Tanabe was younger, sharper, with a mind that could dissect a political system the way a surgeon opens a body, carefully, methodically, and with full understanding of where the vital organs are hidden. Seth Morrow said nothing when he entered. He simply sat in the corner and waited, which was exactly what you wanted from an intelligence operative who had spent the last 12 years living under false identities among alien species. "You have all read the summons," Alara began, standing at the head of the table with her hands flat on its surface. "And you all know what it really means. They want to collar us," Ren said bluntly. "They want to do what they have done to every young species for the last 11,000 years. Yuki corrected him, pulling up a holographic display that filled the room with cascading data. "And they expect us to behave exactly the way every other species has behaved, with fear, confusion, and eventual submission." "Will we?" Seth asked from his corner, and the question hung in the air like smoke. Alara looked at each of them in turn before answering. "We will go to their station," she said. "We will sit in their chamber, and we will listen to every word they say. And then we will do what no species in recorded galactic history has ever done." She did not finish the thought, and she did not need to. They all understood. The journey to the Conclave of Thrones took 11 days through faster-than-light corridors that humanity had only recently learned to navigate. The corridors themselves were ancient, built by species that had risen and fallen long before the eldest members of the GRC were born. And now they served as the highways of a galaxy ruled by 12 self-appointed masters. The Conclave Station itself was enormous, a structure the size of a small moon, hanging in the gravitational sweet spot between 3 dead stars, its surface covered in the architectural signatures of a dozen alien civilizations, each one competing to display its power through towers and spires and docking arrays that stretched out like grasping fingers. When the human ship requested docking clearance, they were made to wait, not for minutes or hours, but for 3 full rotational cycles, nearly 4 Earth days, sitting in a holding pattern while ships from lesser species were waved through ahead of them. "They are establishing dominance," Yuki observed from the bridge, watching as a Valesi trading vessel, half the size of their own, was given priority. "Priority clearance, every moment we wait, is designed to remind us of our place in their hierarchy." "Let them play their games," Alara replied. "We have patience they cannot imagine." When they finally docked, the humiliations continued in ways both large and small. Their quarters were located in the lower decks, the section reserved for service species and maintenance workers, with ceilings too low for comfortable human height, and ventilation systems that recycled air with a stale metallic taste. The formal welcome was delivered not by any of the 12 ruling species, but by a mid-ranking bureaucrat from the Archon Collective, an insectoid creature with clicking mandibles and compound eyes that reflected the humans' faces back at them in 1,000 tiny fragments. "You will be seated in Tier 12 of the negotiation sphere," the bureaucrat informed them, consulting a datapad. "The lowest tier, as befitting your species' standing within the galactic community." Ren's hand twitched toward his sidearm, not because he intended to use it, but because his body reacted to insult the way a soldier's body always does, and Alara placed a gentle hand on his arm without looking at him. "We are honored by any seat at the table," she said with a smile so warm and so perfectly diplomatic that the bureaucrat's antennae twitched in confusion. The negotiation sphere was breathtaking in its design and devastating in its message. It was a vast circular chamber, arranged in 12 ascending tiers, each one higher and more ornate than the last, with the Archon Collective Speaker's chair at the very top, a throne of black crystal that caught the light and shattered it into dark rainbows. The 12 elder species filled the upper tiers like gods looking down from a mountaintop. The Draelith hegemony occupied Tier 1 with their massive reptilian bodies and eyes that burned like molten copper. The Velesi Consortium shimmered in Tier 3 with their aquatic bodies encased in fluid-filled environmental suits, and the Kreth Dominion sat motionless in Tier 5, enormous beings of living stone and crystal who moved rarely and spoke even less. And at the very bottom, in the smallest seats, at the lowest point in the room, where every species above could literally look down upon them, there sat the humans. The Archon speaker opened the proceedings with a sound like 1,000 glass chimes breaking in sequence, and the translation systems rendered it into a voice of cold authority. The Galactic Ruling Coalition recognizes the species designated human and welcomes them to these negotiations with open arms and generous hearts. Let the record show that we extend to this young species the rare privilege of the terms of gracious accommodation. A document appeared on the holographic displays, 4,000 clauses of dense, complex legal language that would take days to read in full, but whose meaning could be summarized in a single sentence. Surrender everything that makes you free, and we will allow you to exist. Yuki had already begun analyzing it on her personal device, her fingers moving rapidly, as she cross-referenced each clause against 40 years of intelligence data that humanity had been quietly gathering about the GRC. After 3 hours, she leaned close to Alara and whispered 5 words that confirmed everything they had suspected. It is identical to all others. Every young species, every single one, for 11,000 years, have received this same document with only minor variations, and every single one had signed it, because the alternative seemed to be annihilation, and because no species had ever conceived that there might be a third option. Ilara listened to the Archon speaker describe the extraordinary generosity of the terms, the caps on human fleet sizes, the surrender of colony worlds, the mandatory tribute payments, the forced sharing of all technological developments, and she kept her face perfectly still, perfectly calm, perfectly unreadable. The elder species watched her from their high seats and saw what they expected to see, a frightened young ambassador overwhelmed by the power and majesty of the Galactic Order, too stunned to speak, too afraid to object. They were wrong about everything. That night, alone in her cramped quarters in the lower decks, Ilara composed a message to Earth's United Governance Council. It was encrypted 17 times using methods the GRC had never encountered, routed through channels they did not know existed, and it contained the full text of the terms, along with a single line of her own. It is exactly what we predicted, awaiting directive. She sent it into the void between stars and sat back to wait, and somewhere deep in her chest, beneath the calm exterior and the diplomatic training and the years of preparation, her heart beat faster, not with fear, but with the fierce and terrible excitement of someone who knows that history is about to change, and that she will be the one to change it. The galaxy had no idea what was coming, and that was exactly how humanity wanted it. 40 years before Alara Voss ever set foot on the Conclave of Thrones, a young intelligence analyst named David Chen sat in a basement office in Geneva and made a discovery that would reshape humanity's future. He had been studying intercepted alien communications, fragments mostly, scattered pieces of data collected by humanity's earliest deep space listening posts, and he had noticed a pattern that no one else had seen. Every species that joined the galactic ruling coalition followed the same path. They were discovered, they were summoned, they were presented with terms, and they signed, every single time, without exception, across 11,000 years of galactic history. They are not an alliance, David wrote in his classified report, underlining the words twice with a red pen. They are a protection racket, and they have been running the same operation since before humans learned to make fire. That report became the foundation of what Earth's government quietly called the Long Preparation. 4 decades of careful, secret work designed to ensure that when humanity's turn came, they would be ready for something no one in the galaxy expected. They studied the GRC's economy and found it was built on extraction, wealth flowing upward from vassal species to the 12 rulers, like rivers feeding an ocean that gave nothing back. They mapped the GRC's military capabilities and found them impressive but brittle, designed to crush weak, disorganized young species, not to fight a prepared and determined enemy. They analyzed the psychology of the 12 elder species and found something remarkable. None of them had faced genuine resistance in thousands of years, and they had forgotten what it looked like. And most importantly, they built quietly, patiently, in the unexplored corners of the Orion Spur, where no alien eye was watching. Humanity constructed defenses that would not be discovered until the day they were needed. All of this, 40 years of preparation, thousands of analysts and engineers and soldiers working in secret, led to this moment, to Alara Voss sitting in the lowest seat of the negotiation sphere and playing a role she had rehearsed 100 times. On the second day of negotiations, the Draelith hegemony made their move. Their ambassador was a creature called Vrek Shadowfang, 7 feet of scaled muscle and predatory grace, with claws that could tear through ship hull plating and a voice that rumbled like distant thunder. He descended from his high seat to Alara's tier, which was itself a calculated display of dominance, a predator coming down to a level of its prey, showing that it could reach them whenever it wished. "You are small," Vrek said, leaning close enough that Alara could feel the heat radiating from his scales. "Your ships are few, your territory is tiny, and your species is young. So young that your entire civilization could fit inside a single chapter of our history." He let those words hang in the air before continuing. "But we are not unreasonable. Sign the terms, and the Draelith will personally guarantee your safety. No species under our protection has ever been harmed." Alara looked up at him, this enormous alien predator designed by evolution to terrify, and she smiled. "We are grateful for the hegemony's concern," she said, "and we would like to discuss the specific provisions of Article 7 regarding fleet limitations. Perhaps there is room for adjustment." She was stalling, and she was brilliant at it. She asked questions about every clause, requested clarification on legal terminology, proposed minor amendments that seemed reasonable, and kept the negotiations moving forward at exactly the pace she wanted. Slow enough to buy time, fast enough to keep the elder species believing that submission was inevitable. On the third day, the Valesi consortium tried their approach. The Valesi were traders, aquatic beings of shifting colors and fluid grace who had built their power not through military force, but through economic control of half the galaxy's trade routes. Their ambassador floated in a mobile aquatic sphere, tendrils pressing against the glass as chromatophores shifted through colors that the translation systems rendered as emotion. Blue for calm authority, gold for generous offering, subtle purple for the threat beneath the generosity. Consider the economic benefits, the Valesi ambassador said, colors rippling. Species that accept the accommodation gain access to the coalition's full trade network, markets spanning 100,000 systems, resources beyond your imagination, technologies that would advance your civilization by centuries. And the tribute payments required in exchange? Yuki asked from beside Alara, her voice perfectly neutral. A small price, the Valesi answered, gold brightening. Think of it as an investment in your species' future. We will consider it carefully, Alara said, and she meant it the way a chess player considers their opponent's trap, with full understanding of its purpose and no intention of stepping into it. While Alara played the diplomatic game in the negotiation sphere, Seth Morrow was doing the real work far below in the station's lower decks. He moved through the service corridors and maintenance tunnels like a shadow, dressed in the plain clothing of a dock worker, speaking to the beings that the 12 elder species never noticed, the laborers. Servants, the maintenance crews drawn from vassal species who kept the conclave running, while their masters sat in high seats and made grand pronouncements. What he found confirmed everything Earth's analysts had predicted, and it was worse than they had imagined. A Belmari maintenance worker, a small, gentle creature with large, dark eyes and 6 delicate fingers, told him in whispered tones about how her species had signed the binding accords 800 years ago, believing the promises of prosperity and protection. They took our best scientists within the first generation, she said, her voice trembling, relocated them to coalition research stations where they worked on projects we were never told about. And when we tried to develop new technologies on our own, the coalition declared them redundant and ordered them destroyed. A group of Renathi engineers, stocky, mineral-skinned beings who had once built magnificent structures across their home system, told Seth how the GRC had systematically dismantled their construction capabilities, forcing them to depend on coalition-approved contractors for everything from housing to infrastructure. We used to build cities that touched the clouds, one of them said with a bitterness that needed no translation. Now, we maintain other species' plumbing. But it was the Tyvori who changed everything. They were avian beings, tall, elegant creatures with iridescent feathers and wings that had once carried them across the skies of their homeworld. Now they served as couriers and messengers, their proud heritage reduced to running errands for their masters. A Tyvori named Kale found Seth in a quiet corridor on the station's outer ring, and the avian's feathers were pressed flat against their body, a sign of fear, Seth knew, but also of desperate courage. I know what you are, Kale said quietly. You are not a dock worker. You move wrong. You watch too carefully, and your hands are too clean. Seth said nothing, which was itself an answer. I have something for you, Kale continued, reaching beneath a wing and producing a small data crystal that glowed faintly blue. This contains records that my people have been secretly copying for 300 years. Proof that the coalition has been deliberately suppressing technological development in every vassal species, keeping us dependent, keeping us weak, keeping us unable to ever challenge their authority. Seth took the crystal and felt its weight. Barely anything physically, but heavy enough to crack the foundations of a galactic empire. Why give this to us? He asked. Kale's feathers rose slightly, not in fear this time, but in something older and fiercer. Because you are the first species I have ever seen that does not look afraid when they sit in the lowest seat, Kale answered. And my people have been waiting a very long time for someone who is not afraid. That night, Seth brought the crystal to Alara's quarters, where the team gathered in the cramped space and reviewed its contents in stunned silence. The records were devastating. Centuries of documented suppression, species after species having their scientific programs gutted, their educational systems controlled, their brightest minds siphoned away to serve coalition interests. They don't just rule them, Yuki said softly, scrolling through the data. They farm them. They keep them just developed enough to be useful and just ignorant enough to never fight back. Ren's face had gone hard as stone. "When do we move?" he asked. "Not yet," Alara said. "We wait for the directive." The directive came 12 hours later. A transmission from Earth, encrypted and hidden inside what appeared to be a routine supply request, containing a single word that Alara had been waiting to hear since the day she accepted this assignment. Walk. She read it once, deleted it, and looked at her team with eyes that burned with something the galaxy had not seen in 11,000 years. The absolute certainty of a human being who has made their decision and will not be moved from it by any force in the universe. "Pack your things," she said quietly. "We leave tomorrow," during the final session in front of everyone. Yuki nodded without hesitation. Ren's hand found the edge of the table and gripped it hard. Not from fear, but from the effort of containing the fire that roared inside him. Simply stood and walked to the door, already thinking about the encrypted channels he would need to open, the messages he would need to send, and the seeds he would need to plant before the morning came. None of them slept that night, not because they were afraid, but because the morning would bring a moment that would echo across every star system in the galaxy, and they wanted to be ready for it. In the lowest quarters of the mightiest station in the known universe, 4 humans sat together and waited for the dawn of a day that would change everything. The negotiation sphere was full. Not just the 12 tiers of ruling species. The observation galleries above were packed with representatives from over 200 vassal species, pressed together in seats that were too small and sections that were too crowded, because the gallery had been designed to hold watchers, not participants. And the GRC had never cared about the comfort of those who were meant only to observe and obey. The Tyvori were there, their feathers held carefully flat, their sharp eyes watching from the upper gallery. The Belmari sat in their quiet clusters, their 6-fingered hands folded in their laps. The Renathi stood along the back wall, because there were not enough seats, their mineral-skinned faces as unreadable as the stone they resembled. Every one of them had come to watch what they believed would be the same ceremony they had seen 100 times. A young species bowing its head and accepting the chains that the galaxy called accommodation. The Archon speaker ascended to the throne of black crystal, and the chamber fell into a silence so complete that you could hear the hum of the station's life support systems breathing through the walls. "This session shall mark the conclusion of negotiations with the species designated human," the speaker announced, compound eyes reflecting the light of 1,000 holographic displays. "The Coalition has reviewed all proposals, considered all amendments, and prepared final revised terms that reflect our extraordinary generosity toward this young and promising civilization." The revised terms appeared on every display in the chamber. 4,000 clauses, restructured and reformatted, but fundamentally unchanged from the original document. The caps on fleet sizes remained, the surrender of colony worlds remained, the tribute payments remained, and the forced technological sharing remained. It was the same cage with a fresh coat of paint. "Never in recorded history," the speaker continued, "has the Coalition offered such favorable terms to a species of humanity's standing. Let this be recorded as an act of unprecedented kindness." In the galleries above, 200 species listened to this performance the way prisoners listen to a judge reading a sentence they already know, with empty eyes and heavy hearts. But something was different today, and the most perceptive among them could feel it. The humans were not behaving the way young species behave in their final session. They were not hunched over data pads, frantically reviewing clauses. They were not whispering anxiously among themselves, and they were not wearing the hollow, defeated expression that every vassal species remembered from their own final day. Ilara Voss sat perfectly still in her lowest-tier seat, her hands resting on her knees, her back straight, and her face carrying an expression that none of the elder species recognized because they had never seen it before. It was peace, the deep, unshakable peace of someone who has already made their decision and is simply waiting for the right moment to speak it into existence. The coalition now invites the human delegation to formally accept these terms, the speaker said, and it was not a question. It had never been a question for 11,000 years. Ambassador Voss, you may approach the signing platform. The silence stretched for 3 heartbeats. Then Ilara Voss stood. She did not approach the signing platform. She remained at her seat, standing tall in the lowest tier of the chamber, while 12 species looked down at her from their heights, and she waited until every eye and sensor and antenna in the room had turned to face her. When she spoke, her voice was calm. It carried no anger, no fear, no desperation, and no defiance. It carried something far more dangerous than any of those things. It carried certainty. Honored members of the Galactic Ruling Coalition, she began, the United Governance Council of Earth has reviewed these terms in full. Every clause, every provision, every implication, and every consequence. She paused. And in that pause, the Valesi ambassador's chromatophores flickered through a color no one had seen before. Something between confusion and the first cold touch of alarm. We find them incompatible with the sovereignty, dignity, and future of our species. The words landed in the chamber like stones dropped into still water, and the ripples spread outward through every tier, every gallery, every corridor where beings listened through audio feeds. The Archon speaker's mandibles clicked rapidly, an involuntary response, the insectoid equivalent of a stammer. Accept these terms, Ilara continued, and her voice did not waver by even a fraction. Humanity will not present counterterms, and humanity will not request further negotiation. She drew one breath, and in the galleries above, a Tyvori named Kale gripped the railing so hard that the metal creaked beneath avian fingers. Humanity withdraws from these negotiations, permanently. The word permanently echoed off the crystal walls and died in the silence that followed, a silence so absolute and so shocked that it seemed to have physical weight pressing down on every being in the room. Ilara was not finished. We wish the Galactic Ruling Coalition well, she said, and the sincerity in her voice was genuine. She did not hate them. She did not wish them harm, and that made it worse somehow, made it more devastating, because hatred could be dismissed, but calm indifference could not. We will not be returning to this station. Tears of ancient power, and walked toward the exit. Behind her, Captain Ren Alistair rose from his seat with the precision of a soldier executing a drill movement, and followed her. Dr. Yuki Tanabe gathered her datapad, stood, and walked with her head high. Seth Morrow was the last to rise, and as he did, he let his gaze sweep the observation galleries one final time. A look that the vassal species would remember and argue about for generations, because some said it was a look of farewell, and others said it was a promise. Their boots struck the floor of the negotiation sphere in measured, unhurried steps. 4 humans walking away from the collected might of a galactic empire, and the sound echoed in the chamber like a heartbeat. The Archon speaker opened their mandibles to speak, but no sound came out. There was no protocol for this, no precedent, no script written in 11,000 years of dominance that covered the possibility of a species simply saying no and leaving. The Draelith ambassador Vrek Shadowfang surged to his feet, claws extended, scales flushing dark with rage. It was a predator's response, ancient and instinctive, triggered not by threat, but by something that violated every law of nature as the Drelith understood it. Prey that was not afraid. "You cannot," he began. But the doors were already closing behind the humans, and his words crashed against them like waves against a cliff. For 5 full seconds, the negotiation sphere remained frozen. 12 species, 200 vassal delegations, thousands of beings, all locked in a moment of collective shock, so profound that it resembled a physical force. Then chaos erupted. The Drelith delegation roared demands for immediate military pursuit. Vrek Shadowfang's claws scored deep gouges in the armrest of his seat as he called for warships to intercept the human vessel before it could leave the station. The Valesi Consortium's ambassador cycled through colors so rapidly that the translation systems could not keep up, fragments of meaning spilling out in broken phrases. Unprecedented. Economic exposure. Recalculate. This changes. The Archon's speaker hammered the ceremonial chime again and again, calling for order that would not come, mandibles clicking in patterns that their own species recognized as panic. 3 of the smaller elder species began arguing simultaneously about jurisdiction and procedure, each one trying to find a legal framework for something that had no legal framework because no one had ever imagined it would happen. The Valesi demanded to know the economic implications. Their entire financial model depended on new vassal species entering the system and providing fresh resources. Humanity's refusal was not just an insult, it was a crack in the foundation. But it was the Kreth Dominion that silenced them all. The Kreth had not moved since the session began. They sat like monuments in their tier, beings of living stone and crystal who thought in centuries and spoke in declarations that carried the weight of mountains. When their ambassador finally spoke, the voice resonated through the chamber like the grinding of tectonic plates. And every other species fell silent, because when the Kreth spoke, it was wise to listen. "You do not understand what has happened," the Kreth said, and the words were heavy with a knowledge that the other species had not yet grasped. "The humans have not rejected our terms, they have rejected our authority." The silence that followed was different from the one before. It was not shock, understanding, spreading like cold water through the chamber. "And every vassal species in this gallery," the Kreth continued, stone eyes turning upward toward the observation tiers, "just watch them do it." Every ruling species in the chamber looked up at the same moment. Up at the galleries where 200 vassal delegations sat in their crowded, uncomfortable seats. And for the first time in millennia, the elder species felt something they had forgotten was possible. They felt afraid. Because in the galleries something had changed. The Tyvori representatives' feathers were raised, not flat in submission, but lifted in the ancient posture of flight. The Balmari delegates were gripping each other's hands with a fierceness that had nothing to do with fear. The Renathi along the back wall were standing taller than anyone had seen them stand in centuries. No one spoke. No one needed to calm. A single wordless, dangerous idea had taken root in the hearts of every vassal species watching from above. An idea that the GRC had spent 11,000 years making sure no one would ever think. Someone said no. Someone walked away, and the galaxy did not end. In the docking bay, the human ship's engines were already warming, as Alara and her team moved through the corridors with purpose, but without haste. They did not run, because running would have meant fear, and what they felt was not fear. As the docking clamps released, and the ship began to pull away from the conclave of thrones, Alara's communication console lit up with a flood of encrypted messages from unknown sources scattered across the station. She opened the first one. It was from the Tyvori, from Kale, and it contained only 7 words that made Alara close her eyes and press her hand against her heart. "We are watching. We remember how to fly." She sat in the captain's chair as the stars stretched and blurred around them, carrying them away from the seat of galactic power and toward a future that no one, not the 12 rulers, not the vassal species, not even Alara herself, could fully predict. But one thing was certain as the sound of boots walking away from 11,000 years of unchallenged authority. Nothing would ever be the same again. In the first week after the walkout, the Galactic Ruling Coalition told itself a comforting story. The humans would return. They always did. Not they as in humans specifically, because no species had ever done this before, but they as in the young, the foolish, the ones who briefly imagined they could stand alone before the cold reality of the galaxy taught them otherwise. Give them a cycle, the Valesi Consortium's senior strategist told the Emergency Council. Chromatophores a confident gold. Their economy cannot sustain itself without access to coalition trade networks. They will exhaust their reserves, their people will grow restless, and their ambassador will send a quiet message asking to resume negotiations. The Draelith hegemony was less patient, but equally certain. If they do not return within one lunar cycle, Vrek Shadowfang declared, his claws drumming against the war table, we burn their border worlds and drag them back to the signing platform in chains. The Archon speaker agreed that patience was the wisest course, and authorized a formal waiting period of 30 standard days, during which the coalition would make no aggressive moves, a show of magnanimity, they called it, which would make humanity's inevitable return all the more humiliating. They waited, and humanity did not come back. Instead, something far worse happened. Humanity disappeared. Not physically, their worlds were still there. Their stations still orbited their stars, and their ships still moved through their own territory. But every connection between humanity and the broader galaxy was severed with surgical precision in the space of a single week. Trade agreements were formally terminated. Human merchant vessels withdrew from coalition shipping lanes. Communication relays were rerouted away from GRC networks, and diplomatic channels that had been open for decades went dark one by one, like lights being switched off in a building that was being quietly and deliberately abandoned. Earth's government called it Protocol Iron Veil, and it had been planned for 20 years. The effect was not immediate. Humanity was a minor species after all, with limited territory and modest economic output compared to the vast machinery of the coalition. And for the first few days, the elder species barely noticed the difference. But by the end of the second week, the cracks began to show. It started in the fringe systems, the border worlds and outer colonies where the coalition's grip was weakest, and where vassal species struggled to survive on the scraps that trickled down from above. These were the places where humanity had been quietly making itself indispensable for decades, not through grand gestures, but through small, persistent acts of kindness that the elder species had never bothered to notice. Human medical teams had been providing healthcare to 17 vassal species, treatments for diseases that the coalition classified as low priority because they only affected beings that the rulers considered expendable. Human agricultural scientists had developed crop strains adapted to the difficult soils of a dozen alien worlds, solutions that the coalition had never pursued because there was no profit in feeding species that existed only to serve. Human arbitrators had been mediating disputes between vassal species for years, providing neutral ground and fair judgment in conflicts that the GRC either ignored or exploited for its own advantage. All of this vanished overnight, and the fringe systems felt it like a wound. On the Belmari homeworld, a fungal plague swept through their grain fields, a plague that human botanists had been helping them manage for a decade, and the Belmari sent urgent requests to the coalition for assistance. The response came after 12 days, a form letter acknowledging the request and informing them that agricultural support would be scheduled pending resource allocation review, which everyone understood meant never. On the Tyvori courier stations, communication systems that human engineers had helped upgrade began failing without maintenance support, and the Tyvori formally requested technical assistance from the Coalition. They were told to submit a technology access request through proper channels, a process that, under the binding accords, required approval from 3 separate elder species, and typically took between 6 months and forever. In system after system, vassal species that had depended on humanity's quiet generosity found themselves alone, and the questions they began asking were not directed at the humans who had left, but at the coalition that remained. Where are the resources we were promised when we signed the accords? Why can you not provide what the humans provided? What exactly are we paying tribute for? These questions terrified the coalition far more than any military threat, because they struck at the one thing the GRC could not afford to lose: the belief among vassal species that the system worked, that obedience was rewarded, and that there was no alternative. Then humanity played its second card. They called it Project Open Hand, and it was devastating in its simplicity. On an ordinary morning across the galaxy, every open communication channel, every frequency that was not encrypted, every relay that carried public broadcasts, every network that vassal species used for news and information, suddenly carried a new signal. It was not propaganda dressed in military language or threats wrapped in diplomatic code. It was the truth. The full contents of the Tyvori data crystal were broadcast in every major language in the galaxy. Centuries of documented evidence showing how the Coalition had systematically suppressed technological development in vassal species, dismantled scientific programs, redirected intellectual talent, and deliberately kept entire civilizations in a state of enforced dependency. Alongside the evidence came a detailed economic analysis, compiled by Earth's best researchers and translated into terms that any species could understand, showing exactly how the binding accords functioned as wealth extraction systems, how tribute payments flowed upward while resources and support flowed nowhere, and how the 12 elder species had grown rich by keeping everyone else poor. And at the end of every broadcast, in every language, a simple message: you were never alone, and you do not have to stay. The effect was like setting fire to a dry forest. 3 vassal species, the Renathi, the Vorleen, and a quiet insectoid race called the Dimchar, formally petitioned the Coalition for release from their binding accords within the first 48 hours. The Archon speaker denied all 3 petitions without deliberation, citing clauses buried deep in the accords that made them irrevocable in perpetuity. Language that, the speaker failed to realize, only proved that the human broadcasts had been telling the truth. A 4th species made no petition at all. The Belmari, gentle, patient, agrarian beings who had never raised a weapon in their 800-year history as a vassal species, simply stopped. They stopped sending tribute shipments. They stopped responding to coalition communications. They stopped attending mandatory check-ins with their assigned administrators. And when GRC officials traveled to Belmari settlements to demand an explanation, the Belmaris said nothing at all. They just stood in their fields, among the crops they had grown with their own 6-fingered hands, and they refused to move. The Coalition sent an enforcement flotilla, 3 warships, and a troop transport, enough firepower to reduce a Belmari settlement to ash, and the ships descended through the atmosphere with weapons hot and landing ramps open. What they found were Belmari farmers standing in rows between their crops, looking up at the warships with their large dark eyes, making no attempt to run, making no attempt to fight, making no attempt to do anything, except exist in quiet, immovable refusal. The enforcement commander, a Draelith officer named Krath, stood in his landing craft and stared at the fields full of small, gentle beings who would not move and did not flinch. And he faced a choice that no military training had prepared him. He could give the order to fire, and the galaxy would watch a Draelith warship murder unarmed farmers. Images that humanity was almost certainly prepared to broadcast across every channel the moment they occurred. Or he could withdraw and admit that the Belmari's quiet refusal had defeated an armed flotilla without a single shot. He withdrew. The images of the Belmari standing in their fields spread across the galaxy anyway. Not from human broadcasts this time, but from vassal species sharing them with each other through networks the coalition could not control. Accompanied by a single phrase that became the unofficial motto of something that was not yet a movement, but was rapidly becoming one. They stood, and the ships left. The Drelith hegemony, humiliated and enraged, decided that enough was enough. If soft power had failed, hard power would not. Vrek Shadowfang assembled a war fleet, 47 capital ships, the largest military deployment the hegemony had authorized in 3 centuries, and he pointed them at the Orion Spur, like a fist aimed at humanity's heart. The fleet crossed into human-claimed space with weapons armed and shields raised, expecting to find either a desperate defense force or an undefended frontier. They found neither. What they found was a network of automated defense platforms hidden in asteroid fields, weapon systems that powered up the moment Drelith sensors touched them, emerging from the rocks like teeth appearing in a smile. Behind the platforms were kinetic batteries built into the asteroids themselves, mass drivers capable of accelerating chunks of iron to a significant fraction of light speed, and sending them screaming across the void with enough force to crack a capital ship in half. All, invisible until they activated, were stealth minefields that lit up Drelith sensor screens like a galaxy of tiny, deadly stars. Humanity had been building this defense network for decades, long before the negotiations, long before the summons, long before the elder species had even noticed that the small, young, seemingly harmless species on the edge of the galaxy was paying very careful attention to everything. Vrek ordered a probe attack. He sent 3 fast cruisers ahead to test the defenses, expecting to lose one and learn from the data. He lost all 3 in under 2 minutes. He sent 4 more, this time with electronic warfare support. 7 minutes, all 4 destroyed, along with the EW frigate. 14 ships lost in 11 minutes, and the human defenses showed no sign of weakening. If anything, they seemed to be adapting, shifting patterns, closing gaps, learning from each exchange, and adjusting their response in ways that suggested an intelligence behind them that was very, very good at this. Vrek Shadowfang stood on his bridge and felt something that no Drelith warrior was supposed to feel. The cold, crawling realization that he had walked into a fight he could not win, against an enemy that had been preparing for this moment longer than he had been alive. He ordered the fleet to withdraw. The galaxy watched that too, and in the silence that followed the Drelith retreat, a single encrypted message traveled through the deepest, most secure channels in the galaxy, bypassing every coalition network, avoiding every monitoring system, arriving directly at Earth's United Governance Council from a source that no one expected. It was from the Kreft Dominion, the beings of living stone who thought in centuries and spoke in truths that lesser species were not always ready to hear. The message contained no threats and no demands and no terms. It contained only a question, written in the simple, direct language that the Kreth preferred above all else. What do you want? And somewhere on Earth, in a room where the leaders of humanity sat together, the question was read aloud and met with smiles, because it was the first honest question any elder species had ever asked them, and they had been waiting a very long time to answer it. 1 year after Ambassador Ilara Voss walked out of the negotiation sphere, the galaxy looked nothing like it had before. The conclave of thrones still floated between its 3 dead stars, its towers and spires still reaching into the void, but entire wings of the station had gone dark. Corridors where vassal delegations once shuffled obediently to meetings now sat empty, their lights dimmed to save power that no one was paying tribute to provide. The 12 elder species still held their seats in the negotiation sphere, but the number 12 had become a lie, because the cracks between them had grown into chasms that no amount of ceremonial unity could bridge. The Drelith hegemony blamed the Valesi consortium for the economic collapse of the fringe systems. Your trade networks failed, Vrek Shadowfang snarled at emergency councils that grew more desperate with each passing week. Your markets were supposed to make them need us. Archon Collective for diplomatic failure. You held the speaker's chair, their ambassador replied, colors cycling through shades of accusation. You were supposed to ensure compliance. That was your function for 11,000 years, and you failed at the one moment it mattered. The Archon Collective blamed everyone and accepted responsibility for nothing, which was perhaps the most honest thing they had done in millennia. 6 of the smaller elder species, races that had joined the coalition not out of strength, but out of fear, riding the coattails of the truly powerful, began quietly distancing themselves from the failing alliance, reducing their participation in joint military exercises, delaying their contributions to shared defense funds, and finding increasingly creative excuses for missing council sessions. But the real transformation was not happening inside the conclave. It was happening everywhere else. 17 vassal species had now either formally requested release from their binding accords, or simply stopped obeying them. And the GRC, which had always maintained control through the threat of overwhelming force, discovered that overwhelming force does not work when it needs to be applied to 17 different species simultaneously across a galaxy too large for any fleet to patrol. The Belmari were still standing in their fields, still refusing to move, and the image of their quiet defiance had become the most widely shared piece of media in galactic history. Every species that had ever been told to sit down and obey saw themselves in those gentle farmers who simply said no with their presence. The Renathi had resumed building, not the structures the coalition had assigned them, but their own designs, their own cities, their own monuments to a heritage that 800 years of servitude had not managed to erase. The Dimchar, the quiet insectoid species, had done something no one expected. They had begun sharing their preserved scientific research with other vassal species through encrypted channels. Research that the coalition had ordered destroyed centuries ago, but that the Dimchar had secretly saved, hidden in biological data storage, woven into the very cells of their bodies. And threading through all of this, like mycelium connecting the roots of a vast forest, was the network that had no official name, but that everyone simply called the Open Network. A web of communication, trade, and mutual support, connected dozens of species to each other, and to humanity, on terms that the galaxy had never seen before. There were no tiers in the Open Network. There were no highest seats and lowest seats, no rulers and ruled, no masters and servants. There were only partners, each bringing what they had and taking what they needed, bound not by irrevocable accords, but by the simple, radical idea that cooperation freely given was worth more than obedience extracted by force. It was into this transformed galaxy that Alara Voss returned to the public stage, not to the conclave of thrones, which she had promised never to revisit, but to a small, unremarkable station in unclaimed space called Meridian Point. The station had been a fuel depot before the lockout. Now it had been converted into a meeting place, its cargo bays cleared and filled with simple chairs arranged in a circle. No tiers, no elevation, no hierarchy of any kind. Representatives from 42 species gathered there on a day that would later be remembered as the beginning of something new. And Alara stood among them, not above them, not in front of them, but among them, one voice in a circle of equals. "I want to be clear about something from the beginning," she said, looking around the circle at faces and forms and bodies that evolution had shaped across 100 different worlds. Humanity did not do what we did because we wanted to replace the coalition. We did not walk away from one empire so that we could build another. She held up a document, a simple thing, 12 clauses on a single display, so different from the 4,000 clauses of the Coalition's chains that the contrast needed no explanation. This is the Treaty of Open Skies, said, and it says only what it needs to say. The treaty guaranteed 5 things. Mutual defense without hierarchy, meaning that an attack on any signatory would be met by all, with no species commanding any other. Free technological exchange, meaning that knowledge belonged to everyone, and no one could suppress the discoveries of another. Open trade without tribute, meaning that commerce would flow based on need and agreement rather than extraction and force. Sovereign equality, meaning that the smallest species had the same voice as the largest. And most importantly, the right of any signatory to leave at any time, for any reason, without penalty. That last clause drew murmurs from around the circle, not of objection, but of something deeper, something that sounded almost like disbelief. "You would let us leave?" asked a Belmari representative, her dark eyes wide, her 6 fingers pressed together in what Alara now knew was an expression of hope, so strong it was almost painful. "The moment you have to ask permission to leave," Alara answered softly, "it is not a partnership. It is a prison." The signing took hours, not because of disagreement, but because each species wanted to speak before they signed, to say what this moment meant to them, to name the pain they had carried, and to declare the future they were choosing. The Renathi spoke of buildings they would raise, cities that touched the clouds, as their ancestors had built before the Coalition stole their tools and their pride. Dimchar spoke in their clicking language of the scientific knowledge they had preserved in their own bodies for centuries, waiting for the day they could share it freely. The Tivori spoke of flight, not just the physical act of flying, which the Coalition had never been able to take from them, but the spiritual meaning of flight, the freedom of choosing your own direction and soaring toward it with wings fully spread. And then, as the signing neared its conclusion, the doors of the meeting space opened, and a figure entered that silenced every voice in the room. The Kreth ambassador was enormous, a being of dark stone and deep crystal that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, moving with the slow, deliberate grace of a mountain that had decided to walk. The Kreth Dominion had been one of the 12 elder species, one of the founders of the Coalition, a pillar of the galactic order for 11,000 years. And no elder species had ever left the GRC. "Until now, we request to sign," the Kreth ambassador said, and the words rumbled through the room like an earthquake felt from very far away. Alara looked at the being of living stone and asked the question that everyone was thinking. Why? The Kreth was silent for a long moment, not the silence of hesitation, but the silence of a being that had thought about its answer for a very long time, and wanted to express it precisely. "We are made of stone and crystal," the ambassador said. "We think in centuries, and we have calculated that the old equation no longer balances. The humans did not defeat us, and they did not outfight us, and they did not outmaneuver us." The crystal veins in the Kreth's body pulsed with a faint inner light. They showed the galaxy that we could be ignored, that our authority could be walked away from, that our power could be simply declined, and that is far more dangerous than any weapon, because weapons can be defeated, countered, and armies can be matched, but irrelevance cannot be fought. The Kreth extended a hand of dark stone toward the document. "We would rather be partners in something new than rulers of something dying." The room erupted, not in chaos, but in something that transcended language, a wave of sound and color and movement that was joy and relief and hope and grief, all woven together, because every species present had lost something to the old order, and every species present was gaining something in this new one. Ilara watched the Kref sign the treaty with a finger of polished obsidian. And then she watched the Tivori ambassador step forward. Kale, the same Kale who had passed a data crystal to Seth Morrow in a dark corridor 1 year ago, and sign with the tip of a wing, feathers raised high in the ancient posture that Ilara now knew was the purest expression of joy the Tivori had. 42 signatures, 42 species. No thrones, no tiers, no one above and no one below. That evening, Ilara stood alone by a viewport on Meridian Station and watched the stars. So many stars, so many worlds, so many beings who were waking up to the possibility that the universe did not have to be organized around fear. Ren found her there, and he stood beside her in comfortable silence for a while, before speaking. "Do you think it will hold?" he asked. "I think it will grow," she answered, "because it is built on the one thing the Coalition never understood. Which is that the strongest bond in the universe is the one people choose freely, and the weakest is the one they are forced to accept." Far away, in the dimming halls of the Conclave of Thrones, the Archon speaker sat alone in the negotiation sphere and replayed the recording of the day the humans walked out, watching it for the 1,000th time, searching for the moment everything changed. Expression that broke the galaxy open. But the speaker never found it, because it was not a word or a gesture or an expression. It was simpler than that. It was the sound of 4 pairs of boots, walking steadily, unhurriedly, and without fear, toward an open door. And the sound of that door closing behind them, with a soft and final click that echoed across 11,000 years of unchallenged power, and shattered it all, not with war, not with threats, not with weapons or fleets or fire, just with the quiet, unshakable human conviction that freedom is not something you negotiate for. It is something you carry with you when you walk away from anyone who tries to take it. And in the archives of the Tivori, where history was kept in crystal and light and the memory of wings, a new volume was opened, volume 9412, titled simply The Year the Doors Opened, and its first entry read, "They did not conquer us, and they did not threaten us. They simply stood up, turned around, and left. And the galaxy, the whole galaxy, remembered that leaving was an option."